Hi, welcome to session 14 of our study in the book of Hebrews. We're in chapter 11, and today we're going to be looking at verses 7 through 22. Okay? We began chapter 1 last week, and we will finish it next week. But for this week, we're going to be looking at a 15-verse segment of the book of Hebrews chapter 11, also known as, or nicknamed as, the faith chapter. It's all about faith, about people of faith, and let's see what we can learn from this. Now, to talk about faith, let's begin with the fact that we put our faith in a lot of things much less important than God and eternity. At night when I go to bed, I set alarms and I expect them to go off in the morning. I expect them to wake me up in the morning. When I turn a light switch, when you turn a light switch on, you expect the lights to come on. When you turn a faucet, you expect water to come out of it. When you turn the key in a car, you expect it to start. This is our expectation. This is what we have become accustomed to. So it's without even thinking, we're putting our faith in these inanimate objects because that's the way they're supposed to be. That's how they've been in the past, and so that's how we expect them to be now. We have, in a way, put our trust, our faith in these different items and these different things. Yeah, I have a dog, and some of you have met her. She is a rambunctious one. She loves to run and loves to follow scents and adventure. And yesterday she got out of the backyard when some workmen opened the gate and didn't know she was back there. And I go walking down our street as she's whooping back and forth and up driveways and back across. She is so fast. And she is loving her freedom. She gets to the end of our road. It's a dead-end street, but I know that on the other side of our dead end, there's a hedge there. And on the other side of that hedge is a private school with a parking lot that opens up on an extremely busy street. And she is so far ahead of me that I can't see where she went to when she got to the end of the street. And I start worrying. I start thinking that she's not going to make it. She's going to go through there and she's going to get hit by a car because she has no clue of the danger that is out there. And I am trying to protect her. Protection is keeping her in our backyard so that, it's not that she lives out there, but she had wanted to go out, and I let her out, and there's piles of room for her to run. There are some trees in the far end, some bushes all over. I know that there are squirrels and chipmunks and all kinds of things, and, birds all over the place. This is a Garden of Eden for her, yet she escapes from it and has no clue of the danger that's out there. And when I finally got to the end of the road, just to finish the story, I'm walking in the yard of the last house, whistling and calling her name, and the neighbor calls me and says, she's in our backyard, and we close the gate. Sigh of relief. Thank you, Lord, because I had been praying that she wouldn't end up dead. And I went there. It took some corralling to finally get a grip on her, and I proceeded to hold her tightly to my chest and walk up the street back home. And all I could think of is reminded me of Jesus talking about the lost sheep out of the 100 and how the shepherd would go looking for them. And they don't understand the danger they're in. Well, so many people in our world today, maybe even us ourselves, don't realize, have not grasped the concept of how much danger we are in if we don't put our faith in God, if we don't put our faith in Jesus. And we are looking at it from the other side. We have Jesus' death and resurrection testified to by dozens, if not hundreds of people who saw him alive, who saw the death and saw him alive and saw the Roman records and all this stuff. And we're on this side and we're having trouble having faith in it, putting faith in this. Imagine the people, the faithful people, the faith-filled people in the Old Testament who were going by, if God said it, it's going to be. And God first says it to Adam and Eve. And he says, okay, I'm going to have to fix this. I'm going to send a Savior who will fix this broken relationship between us. And then he tells Noah, is like, you got to build an ark because the world's going to flood. And then he tells Abraham, I want to make a great nation out of you, countless people, millions of people, more than the stars you can count. He tells Moses, here are a set of rules. I want to make this family, these descendants of Abraham, I want to make them from just an extended family to a nation. And here are the laws for them to follow. And that's just the first part. And I don't want to go any further because that's going to be next week. That we're referring to next week. But we've already talked about Noah and Abel and Enoch last week. This week we're going to talk mainly about Abraham. Now, when I was doing the study on these 15 verses, I had a seminar this past week, and maybe sometime I'll talk to you about what I learned there. But one thing that was commented was that sometimes this person reads a chapter or a book in the Bible and underlines all the nouns, or another time he'll underline all the verbs, or it's like just pick something. So that gave me the idea to look for all the verbs. What are the verbs from God to his people? And what are the verbs of these faithful? What did they do? These faithful, what does this kind of faith look like? What does this kind of faith act like? And maybe that's what we need to be internalizing and recognizing and looking for in ourselves. Are we willing? Are we so trusting and putting our faith completely in God so that we are living this way? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the whole section, 15 verses, all in a row, and I am going to try and emphasize the verbs as I go along. Now, I am not a grammar teacher. I have probably missed some verbs. I have probably misdiagnosed some words and think they're verbs. I'm not going to worry about that. I want us, by and large, I think I got it right. So we're going to listen for the verbs. And if I don't mention one and you read it, underline it in your Bible. I really invite you to be following this in your own Bible. Book of Hebrews, chapter 11. I am reading from the New International Version, so that will be the one that most will match if that's what you're looking to be able to follow along at the same time. Yeah, let's just get into this. It actually turned out to be quite an interesting list. It's a page and a half of words in these 15 verses. So let's begin. Oh, it's actually verse 8, beginning with verse 8. We did verse 7 last week. So it's verse 8, and we're going from 8 to 22. Okay? By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By faith, Abraham, even though he was past age and Sarah herself was barren, was enabled to become a father because he considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. And they admitted that they were aliens and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had received the promise was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead, and figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions about his bones. That's a lot altogether. Normally we'd take it in segments right from the beginning, but I wanted you to read, to hear this evolution, this growing, this constant of faith from generation to generation. So now we're going to look at it in segments. We're going to look at the first segment about Abraham first. There are a couple things that he does in this segment. And actually, we're going to break his segment up into two pieces. We're going to look at the first thing, and then the second thing. Then we're going to go to other people, and then back to Abraham, and then to his descendants. Okay? So, by faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise, for he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Okay, the first thing is God calls him. Salvation always begins with God calling us. He's at the door knocking. The Bible even says it. Jesus is at the door knocking. Open the door, please. He is calling on us first. And so God calls Abraham to leave the place he lives in. Now we know this, that he originated in the city of Ur. And I'm telling you, Ur, in fact, this little box way up here, right? Well, you did get my arm there. There we go. That box right there is called the Game of Ur. It's been discovered in the ruins of that part of the country, which is now Iraq. That Ur was a huge metropolis. Let's just say it was a metropolis. It was like New York or Chicago. It was this big city for its day. And compared to, it's not as large as New York and Chicago, but compared to the rest of the world, Ur was a huge city. Very cosmopolitan for its day. And God calls Abraham to leave this city where he has a house and all of the stuff that a city can offer, and calls him to go to this promised land that he will never own, that he will live in tents for the rest of his life. And this city dweller says, okay, I trust you. I have faith in you. I have faith that you will fulfill your promise. And so this man takes everything he has, his family, his dad, and they head out of Ur. They settle for a while in Haran, which is a smaller town, but at least it's still a town, until his father dies. And then he heads out for the promised land, and for the rest of his life lives in tents. Not just him, but his son. And not just him, but his sons. They become nomads. And actually it continues for a little while. They become a nomadic family without a city, a home to call their own. They are strangers in a strange land. If you've ever been to another country, especially if you don't speak the language, or can read the signs, anything, it's definitely different. I was in my 50s. Yeah, I was in my 50s the first time I was in a country where I didn't speak the language, because I am bilingual. So I have been to many countries where you either speak English or Spanish, and I have no problems with that because I am reasonably fluent in both. But when you go to countries that you don't speak the language and you can't read the signage, and and if you go to a country that doesn't use the Roman alphabet, the alphabet that we're used to, and they use Cyrillic or whatever kind, or even more so, you definitely feel like a stranger in a strange land. And you get to the point where you're like hoping to be able to go back to something that you know. But Abraham, what faith to pick up and change the rest of his life from all that he knew just because God called him and gave him a promise. Abraham had faith in God. He knew that God was faithful. And this is something important for us to recognize. God does not lie. He cannot lie. So when he says something, we can depend on it. When the Bible tells us God says this, God does not lie. We can put our faith in it. We need to put our faith in it. Now, so this is the big first thing that Abraham does. And you know, like it says, he went to, made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, but he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. He was looking forward to that. He knew that there will be a day where I will live in the city that God has built. And I will not be a stranger in a strange land. I will be home. I will be where I am meant to be. What God has prepared for him, for you. The next section about Abraham's faith, it begins in verse 11 and 12. By faith, Abraham, even though he was past age and Sarah herself was barren, was enabled to become a father because he considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. So here's another time in Abraham's life where faith comes into effect. When God tells him he's going to have a son, and his descendants through this son are going to be innumerable. And when it says he was enabled to become a father because he considered him faithful who had made the promise. Abraham was enabled to become this father because he had put his faith on God who had made this promise, because he knew God was faithful and faithful to keep that promise. And it occurred. It happened. Even though he was 90, 100 years old, he had a son. Even though Sarah had been barren at age 80, 90, she has a son. Faith. Putting our faith in the one who is faithful. And now, in the next few verses, 13 through 16, we talk about, it's kind of like an overview of all the people mentioned in this chapter, and all the people who were faithful not mentioned in this chapter, but that had been faithful throughout the whole Old Testament, never seeing that promised Messiah, but knowing that God had promised it and he would come. And so they put their faith in that, and they lived their life with that understanding. So here, 13 through 16, all these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, from a promise. And they admitted that they were aliens and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. All these people in the Old Testament that had put their faith in God, it was as if they realized at that point that this life is not the real life that God has waiting for us. This is a good life. This can be a gifted life. This can be a treasured life. But they were looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they left, or the life that they left behind, as Christians, you start pondering about that life you left behind and looking behind you. At any time in this life, you can always go back to it. I mean, God's not forcing you to put your faith in him. But here's the example of what happens to those who do put their faith in God and keep their faith in God, and their goal in life is that country, that city, that place that God has prepared for them for eternity. They are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. But instead, they were longing for a better country, a better way of life, a better future, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. He keeps his promise. Jesus even mentions that. It's like, I go to prepare a place for you. And if it weren't so, it's like, and by the way, I'm coming back for you. These are promises that we have in our future, and we need to put our faith in that because we have seen it from afar, from a distance. We have seen the promise from a distance. And God is telling us, the author of Hebrews is telling us, we need to put our faith in that distant promise. Incredible. Verses 17 through 19, we come back to Abraham. Another event in his life where he shows faith, total faith in God. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had received the promise was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead. And figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. God has promised the son, and that through him, innumerable will be his descendants. And then he tells him to sacrifice him. And Abraham is willing and ready to do it, not because he doesn't care about Isaac, not because he believes that God wants him to sacrifice his child like some of the pagan gods that he lives around, surrounded by worshipers of, but because he really does believe that somehow God will take care of this, because he promised that my descendants would come through Isaac. So if I kill him, God can bring him back to life. Somehow God will do this. And at the last moment, God spares Isaac from death and resurrection, because God can resurrect from the dead. We know this now. But Abraham, this This is before you have all those prophets where some of them do raise from the children from the dead and such. Those are his descendants that are coming through Isaac. Yet Abraham has such faith in God. He knows that God is faithful, that God does not lie, that God does not change things once he's made a promise. And God is true. He's true to his word. And Isaac is spared. Abraham is spared the pain of doing a sacrifice. And he is aware, even more so now. He has even more reason to put his faith in God because God has proven faithful yet again. And now to his immediate descendants. Verses 20 through 22. By faith, Isaac, that young man that was going to be sacrificed, by faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. Jacob and Esau were his sons, twin sons. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons, his 11th son. Jacob's 11th son, Joseph, was his favorite. He blessed Joseph's sons, and to his dying day, and worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff, saying, basically, to the end of his life, his old age, he worshipped God. That was Jacob. By faith, Joseph, that son of Jacob's, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions about his bones. He had so much faith in God, Joseph, in Egypt, that when it was getting close to his death, he basically said, okay, I know God has promised us that land. He promised it to our ancestor Abraham. So when I die, I want you to keep track of my bones. And when the day comes that God has us has the Israelites exit Egypt, I want you to take my bones and bury them in the promised land. And they did. Years and years later, generations and generations later, when Moses comes along, when they do leave Egypt, what do? They take Joseph's bones to bury him back in what ends up being their promised land, the nation of Israel. And that's the reading for today. That's the push. It's like this faith. Faith to go out, get out of our comfort zone. Faith to believe the impossible. Faith to treat this life as not our own and not the ultimate one, but a transitory one and a life outside of our real promised land. We learned from here that we need to welcome discomfort in God's name. That we need to put trust even up to death. Because God can raise the dead. We need to put our faith in God and bless the next generations through our life, through the way they are raised, through teaching them about God so that they in turn can bless the next generation, and that generation can bless the next generation. To their dying day, they worship the true God. And we're not done with this chapter yet. It is an incredible mine, not of gold or diamonds or silver, but of examples of what it means to live putting our trust, our faith in God, and how true God is to his word, how faithful he is unto us. And that's it for today. That is our study of chapter 11, verses 8 through 22. And next week we will finish this chapter, verses 23 to the end, which is verse 40. And we will look at a few more people and look at their stories and see what we can learn about their faith that we can put into our life, our mentality, our switching on that light because we know God's there. We can depend on him because he is faithful. You can put your faith in God. May God bless you and keep you, make his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. Until next week, bye.